Good morning.
Good morning, everyone. Hope you all are doing well, fine, and safe. We welcome everyone and thank you for being a part of the webinar. ISCM in association with SAP brings you on stage today discussion with the CPG industry leaders on the theme Consumer Packaged Goods Supply Chain Resilience Post-Pandemic. To open the session, let me invite on stage Dr. Rakesh Singh, Chairman of Institute of Supply Chain Management. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaisal, and welcome everybody to the webinar on Consumer Packaged Goods Supply Chain Resilience Post-Pandemic. To set the tone in the start, I thought we'll just have a 5-6 minutes inaugural address. And looking at the pandemic, what we have seen is that we need to talk about pandemic, but we also need to move ahead. And while moving ahead, we definitely need to have a kind of a view of what the pandemic was in its initial stages and what dynamic character it is taking today, and how do we really return and reimagine the new normal or the next normal as people call about it. Supply chain resilience have to take into account the factors that contributed to the risk and uncertainty in the end-to-end supply chain. And when I say end-to-end supply chain, it is from the factory to the customer or consumer, and it is factory to the last tier of supplier. What happened? What kind of disruption took place? And if you see, if procurement organizations faced a large range of challenges. Huge amount of supply chain disruption on the demand side, also had a disruption on the supply side. But that was only because the supply side was disrupted and there was a regulations and lockdowns by the government. There was unnatural demand shift that happens. And during the demand shift, we saw a huge amount of consumer behavior changes in terms of consumption baskets, in terms of channels, in terms of frequency of shopping, in terms of brand. We saw private label doing very well, and there was a lot of pent-up demand that was created, and there was a lot of bias towards essential commodities because of the nature of survival that happened. So we saw a huge shift in demand that in turn has a huge impact on supplies and supply chain risk and supply chain disruption. In fact, sharp decline in demand as we see the global GDP, and we have seen Indian GDP tanking by 23.9%, creates a very enormous challenge for the supply chains to react and imbibe these patterns of demand into their entire supply chain, starting from distribution to production to sourcing to managing sourcing. And we have seen that need to both ramp up and ramp down supply chain has become enormous during the pandemic, which is also happening. The nature of demand still continues to be different, though there is a good hope that we see that there is a lot of bouncing back of the industry back to some percentage of 60, 70, 80, 90% of their February levels. And I think that's a good sign. But I think this could be just because of pent-up demand, and this could be just a surge in demand post the lockdown. And one needs to be very careful in taking those signals to aligning the supply chain in the whole segments. And in fact, what is also happening is that there is a big tension in the commodity pricing that's taking place. The big question lies then, how are we going to be more resilient in our framework? And on the demand side, I think there are enormous challenges of doing away with the assumption of forecasting, demand planning, moving away with something where we can foresee the scenario, taking into account the length of the pandemic. How do you build different scenarios, and how do you execute these scenarios through either your SNOP and IVP to see that we are on a very good path? We also saw a very good thing that people got into their war rooms. They started thinking together. They started working together. They managed the supplies in the short run, and they also managed the disruptions because of consumer behavior in a big way at costs that were not sustainable in the long run. But obviously, yes, there was a kind of understanding that happened. So how do we restructure your overall understanding of planning in the post lockdown and unlockdown period so that we return to a new normal which is defined in a very way? Do we have transparency in procurement metrics beyond spend and cost? How well can we understand supply market exposure and the associated risk with it? Do we have the flexibility to move from one market to another market, look at diverse and alternative supply sources in the whole process? Do our people have the capabilities needed to plan and act independently? Is our digital infrastructure mature enough to support report working, provide easy information access to support decisions? And answer to planning, answer to your mapping of your supply chain risk on both inbound and outbound side, ability to bring transparency, agility, and granularity into your whole process, and then manage your spend, manage your demand, manage your securing of trucks, securing of warehouses, and securing of a global supply chain against the kind of disruption that has happened in the both air and sea cargo. And I think that is going to be a challenge that we face. Resilience is just not about being an alternative source of supply. Resilience is about building the flexibility of destination of supplies and destination of demand. And how do you bring that flexibility in the most optimal way by training and letting people understand this and empowering people? If partnering with our partners, both suppliers and the 3PLs, making work things in a more seamless way, going to connected planning through the kind of technologies that we have, and building in connected planning a one view of supply chain and not a distorted silos views of supply chain. And hence, it is very important that we have a portfolio review as dynamics will keep changing. We have a demand review as dynamics keep. We need to have a supply and production review. You need to have a logistics and warehousing review within your SNOP or within your IBP, which is lacking dimensions that people have ignored in their end. Procurement review. Procurement means the end-to-end procurement and last mile. I think there is a need for stress test, and in such pandemic, building up a resilience requires that your time to survival is longer than your time to recover. And if your time to recover is longer than time to survival, then you do not have a resilience. And hence, building up resilience requires an amazing rethinking of the old supply chain, what ought to have been done and has not been done, and what has to be done given this new normal, which has been defined appropriately. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. I think we are going to have interesting discussions for the next hour. And I would like to invite on stage all our speakers and continue the discussion. Let me invite on stage Radha Mohan Gupta, Regional Procurement Director from Reckitt Benckiser, Tarun Gakhar, Head of Procurement Operations at Kellogg's Company, Archana Bhoite, Procurement and Hub Leader India at Mondelez India, Rituraj Saha, Head Supply Chain at Pernod Ricard India, Gordon Donovan, Intelligence Spend Evangelist at SAP, and Dr. Rakesh Singh, Chairman, Institute of Supply Chain Management. I would request Dr. Singh to kindly take up the discussion further, and all attendees to kindly type in and send us your questions. Thank you.
Good morning, fellow panelists, and welcome to the webinar. And I have the privilege of steering the webinar. I've already given my viewpoints, so I would, love to hear your viewpoint on it. To start with, I think the very first question, as I said, that resilience requires a new thinking post-pandemic. Even when the pandemic is becoming more dynamic, when lockdown are happening across the globe, and so in India, despite we have still not reached the peak. I'll start with Rituraj. Rituraj, you have been at the forefront of managing logistics, demand as a head of supply chain in a very interesting malt industry. And that has been one which has been affected very badly. And also, it came up in a big way. In between one fine day, we saw the whole of India lining up for malts, right? And that was Absolutely. Very interesting to see that. What, according to you, would be the future of demand planning, and I would say planning as such, based on what has happened in the past, and how would you build resilience into our processes?
Great. Thank you, Dr. Rakesh. I hope everyone can hear me clearly.
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. So, thanks for asking this question, Dr. Rakesh. I think you mentioned about transitioning to a new normal. So, one thing is for sure, all of us have transitioned to a new normal situation, and this situation is going to be very different from what we used to have in pre-COVID scenario. And we have seen, talking about demand plan, we have seen significant shift in demand pattern for our products, be it in terms of pack wise interplay, or in terms of brand wise interplay, or in terms of channel wise preference, or there is a degrowth in on-trade channel because bars and restaurants have shut down, but it is equally compensated by double-digit growth in off-trade channel. We are also seeing consumers shifting toward e-commerce channel because this pandemic has presented a new growth opportunity, especially for alcohol industry, and because the consumers have started shifting to online channel, have started placing orders through an online channel, and in fact, liquor being a highly regulated industry, earlier we were not allowed to vend our products or distribute our products through an online channel. Now, state governments have allowed us to distribute and sell our products through an online channel. So that's a new growth opportunity that has, that has opened up for our industry. Talking about how we are coping up with ever-changing increase in demand. I think as you've rightly said, we have to increase resilience across our supply chain to be able to adapt to a new normal situation. So let me just talk about some of the steps that we have taken to increase resilience in our supply chain. Number one, it's about digitalization. Digitalization of supply chain is all about providing visibility of information across all nodes of the supply chain, sharing of information with all stakeholders simultaneously, ensuring that our collaboration with stakeholders improves, and collaboration, when I'm talking about stakeholder, I'm also talking about the collaboration with extended business partners, and enabling real-time response on planning and execution. So immediately after lockdown, we actually initiated an express SNOP meeting, which is all about doing daily or weekly huddle to understand how our demand pattern is changing and how we have to rewire or redesign our backend to be able to meet our new requirements. We have also, you talked about connected planning process. So we have rolled out a connected supply chain tool to automate end-to-end demand and supply planning process to make our entire supply chain more demand-driven and agile. It's all about agility nowadays. So we have to make your operations more demand-driven and agile, supported with connected process and tools. So that's another initiative that we have taken, and they were leveraging to drive agility in our supply chain. Then we are talking about upstream. When we are talking about upstream of supply chain, we import a Scotch malt from Scotland, and there's so much we can do to compress our supply chain, because so Scotch malt cannot be produced and procured from India, So when moreover, we also import premium whiskies, wines, vodka from around 13 countries. So when this lockdown was announced back in March, we were able to assess the entire inventory situation through our system called Connect, that provide full visibility of transaction right from order placement till to delivery, to real time visibility of our shipment all the way till delivery to our warehouse. So we assessed the situation and we immediately calibrated our orders to ensure that we are not saddled with high inventory in our ports as well as in our warehouse in March and April. So that's how we immediately that's how we actually responded to the situation on the ground. And then talking about the downstream sector, we have implemented logistics control tower to do real-time tracking of our trucks. We had close to around 400 plus trucks stranded on Indian road when lockdown was announced back in March. But through this initiative, we were able to ensure that our trucks and drivers are safe. And we also gave advanced notification. We kept our customer informed on our incoming shipment, so there's no anxiety on account of trucks lying on road. So these are some of the initiatives that we have taken to ensure that we are able to adapt to new normal and to and adapt to a new situation more effectively and more efficiently.
Thank you, Rituraj. I think I have seen large amount of organization in India, and even the retail organizations now are really looking at their, uh, commodity spends, even their category planning. And what they're doing is that they're producing something which is being demanded by the market. And that poses a large amount of challenge in terms of what transportation do you need? Are transportation available? How do you secure transportation? How do you secure warehouses? Because it has become largely in the process of transition, it has become hyper local. Some markets still are better than other markets. Opening of the markets have actually harmonized selling to a great extent, but there are certain markets which are badly affected, and hence there's a more hyper-local approaches that are happening, and people are securing warehouses in the city, and city logistics is becoming so important. So there is a lot of change that is happening. Moving on to the second side of coin, other side of the coin, in terms of supplies, let me bring Archana. And Archana, what, according to you, are the procurement organization challenges post-pandemic? What
I hope
are
I'm
the
audible to
challenges?
everyone here.
Yes, you are. You are.
So I think when we envisaged the lockdown, it was much ahead in time, December, because we were learning from China and what is happening there. So much before the lockdown in the country in India, we were prepared that we are definitely going to get into a lockdown situation eventually because of coronavirus. And we prepared all our offices and manufacturing facilities with sanitizers, health equipments, HSC related things for employees to work in a safe environment within our facilities. That was very important while the coronavirus was spreading in. Other than that, in terms of procurement, as you rightly said, when the pandemic hit us and the lockdown happened, 15 days, the rules were very strict by the government. The magistrates were giving permissions for factory operations, supplier operations. There were containment zones defined. There were red zones. There were green zones. So accordingly, to get all our suppliers operational was the first most critical thing to bring on the ground across India, not only for the imported supplies. I will say the customs were also challenged at some point in time with the government officials not being there at customs and in full strength. So none of the operating companies were allowed to operate in a full strength of employees, and they were partially staffed. So looking at all these things and still turning around the business was the major challenge that was taken over by all the companies, I will say.
Thank you, Archana. Tarun, if you can add on that, because you come from a similar industry and you all have done some amount of amazing work in order to secure your pandemic supply chain. Maybe building resilience is still a challenge, but how do you move from meeting the challenges of business continuity to resilience on the supply side?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Singh. So I would first of all completely agree with what Archana said. I can reflect that in the last over 6 months, how we have been able to manage our supplies, and I guess all of us went through the similar kind of issues, and we had something similar kind of solutions that came out actually. So if you look back, it's now 6 months since this all started, rather more than 6 months. And initially when it hit China, being a multinational organization, we knew that it was impacting some of the suppliers who were based out of China. So there was some BCPs put in place where we took that we made up a plan and took that action to inventorize some of the key stuff that was coming through China. We also knew that there will be disruptions on the port, sooner or later, whether it's the supply port or the destination port. So, there were some key raw materials, packaging materials, etc., that were built up, so that we, the moment these restrictions happen, we can last for some more time, given the strategic inventory. And I think beyond that, as the lockdown was announced in India, all of us are aware that the factories came to a grinding halt, the supply shut down, and it was for a couple of weeks, at least 3 weeks, that there was no economic activity at all. However, given that we were in the essential industry, we got permissions, and so did our suppliers. So not all of them were given permissions to start, because they don't necessarily or essentially supply to this industry. But given that we had the permission to operate, we helped our suppliers to come back to at least a part of their production setup. And that's how we built it over a few months. I think the major challenges that we faced were that there's some suppliers who were still not able to come to the level of expectation that we wanted in terms of supplies, in terms of quantity, because of different reasons, whether they were in lockdown zone, or whether they were impacted due to manpower, etc. So I think that point of time, it was imperative that there was a second option, if that was created. If there was none, then we scrambled through the options, and we created backup suppliers for some of the key materials that were impacted. And thankfully, we were able to do that. So as I look back and see that what we have learned over the last 6 months, I think essentially 2 or 3 things that I want to call out. First, having a look at a thorough look at the risk management on your supplies. I think that's something which needs more scrutiny than anything else today, given the uncertainties that we have faced. The other thing is the supplier relationship management bit. I think the whole buzzword around SRM is great, but the proof of the pudding is when you actually hit the road, and you now need the suppliers to come back and to service you. I think that's something which is going to be critical. And thirdly, looking at your demand cycle, I think before the pandemic hit us, there was a S&OP process that was followed. But the moment we restarted after the lockdown, the whole focus was on our specific SKUs that were going to be served in the market, not across the all portfolio. And it was ensured that everything that goes for those SKUs was managed well. So it was very focused work around those SKUs, and they might need something which is coming from maybe a tier 2 or tier 3 supplier, but so be it. If that has to happen, that has to happen. So there was focus built on those suppliers, but these SKUs were what were completely supported. And then as things started to look better, the portfolio really started to increase in terms of the SKU management in the market. So I think that was what the learnings were. And as we move out of this phase, although we are not completely out of woods, as a lot of people say, I think it's going to be critical to have a constant look at the risk management. How an organization puts that into place. How do you want to diversify? How do you want to ensure that your supplies are not impacted if one or two suppliers get impacted because of something else? So I think that's the key. That's going to be playing a important role going forward in terms of managing the supply chains.
Thank you, Tarun. Thank you, Tarun. And let me go to Gordon now. Gordon, the role of spend analytics, the way it is, the way it ought to have been, will it change post-pandemic? And what are the dimensions of change that you foresee going forward during the pandemic, and how we would start spending wisely and strategically?
Spending wisely and strategically. Okay, we'll give this a go. So I think initially, when we think about what we do with spend analytics from procurement, the most sort of immediate task for spend analytics is going to be about providing transparency and insight into where cash is being spent and where cash isn't being spent. I think primarily that's procurement organizations' primary objective is to optimize external spend, with suppliers, and realize where there's a source of competitive advantage. I think not just in terms of cost and quality, but I think sustainability is becoming greater and greater and greater. And you touched on that in your opening discussion. I think it's also going to be used to shed a light on the movement of some consumer demand as a lagging indicator, and I might just touch on that in a little bit. But driving visibility into external spend, it's going to make it easier, I think, for your organization to identify where you've got opportunities across supply markets, maybe even across multiple categories and subcategories and suppliers and locations, as well as volumes and pricing. So I think initially that's where it's going to come to, and then what I think is going to change a little bit more post-pandemic is the role it takes in both strengthening supply chains and building resilience in supply chains. So I think spend transparency and spend analysis can help provide a consistent fact base for informing supply discussions and then informing strategic planning for what you want to do with that. Generally, we find a lot of spend is dotted all over the place. So trying to bring all of this spend monitoring effort into a single place is going to enable procurement teams to benchmark different parts of the organization, depending on how spend is dispersed throughout the organization, which is going to allow you to start benchmarking against each other internally, so that you're figuring out where things are going and where things aren't going, as well as then potentially planning and benchmarking externally. I think what we've seen throughout COVID-19 pandemic is that many organizations have set up, as my colleague earlier said, spend towers, spend control towers, crisis nerve centers. These have been set up because of this. I think what we're going to see is a greater use of those to start looking at how we take things that may have been set up because of the pandemic and start bringing them into what a post-pandemic world looks like. And then finally, I think because spend analytics creates transparency, and it creates transparency that goes just beyond just spend and cost. What it does, I think, is it highlights supply market exposure and risks. I think one of the things that's been identified, not just within consumer packaged goods, but across everywhere, is probably how ready or unready we were from a risk management perspective. So what I think spend analytics can do is, say, create that transparency that will highlight market exposure risks, such as where we've got a reliance on a single source or reliance on a region. I have friends of mine work in the US, and they have a lot of things exposed in certain parts, and whilst they've dual sourced geographically in the same place. So whilst they may have sorted one risk, they've then just exposed themselves to another risk. So I think that's one of the things that it's going to help, or what we can use spend analytics to do, is to drive that transparency to enhance supply chain resilience, which, bearing in mind, is something that I think all my panelists have talked about so far as well, is that need to drive some resilience and having the agility to respond to the changing consumer demand. And I was listening to a Harvard Business Review podcast with the CEO of AB InBev, and to echo the first panelist, he talked about the changing consumer demand. All of a sudden, people weren't obviously going to bars and going to restaurants, and so one of the first things that they did was that they changed the packaging, because they realized that it would be more off-premise purchase and it would be in bigger bulk. So they immediately changed the packaging. That was the first thing that they did. And then they recognized that the cash perspective, so when you're thinking about how you're going to drive resilience, is how you're going to manage the cash flows, not just your cash flows, but the cash flows throughout the supply chain. And spend analysis will help see and track where that spend is actually going. So I think that's how spend analysis is going to help sort of post-pandemic.
Thank you, Gordon, for such a simple and a very strategic view, though you wanted to let go that. Coming back to Radha, Mohan, Gupta, can you tell us what kind of risk did you all face during the pandemic? And what are your views on those risks as such? From a procurement perspective, what risks did you face? Can you hear me? Can you all hear me?
Yes.
We lost
Yeah,
you in between.
no, we can hear you. I think Radha, you are on
All
mute.
no, Radha, can you hear me now?
Yes, doctor, I can hear you now. Earlier, I was not able to.
Okay. I said, what are the kind of supply chain risks that your organization faced or you think Indian organization faced during the pandemic, and how do you, suggest the way forward to managing those risks?
Great. Good morning, everyone. And thanks, Dr. Singh and Jaisal, to invite me over here. And I've been hearing from Archana, Rituraj, and Tarun, and now Gordon. Of course, much have been talked about that what are the risks which organization face during this one. I think I will broadly say that there was a period when it was a shock period, and that shock period was when everybody was caught unaware of this lockdown and the situation which came in, and it was an era where we talked about what to do, and whatever came to people's mind, they worked it out, and slowly the situation improved over a period of time. However, if you categorize the risks which organizations generally faced during this pandemic, certainly if you start from the supplier side, from the sourcing point of view, it was certainly in terms of getting the supplies at the right time and the right product in the plant to run your own plant. That was the biggest risk which happened during the supplies, that how to manage the supplies from your suppliers. Second thing was how to run your own plant, because there were permissions given to some of the plants for essential goods, and the other commodities or other products were not allowed. So there was again how to manage your supplies during this time from your own plant. And finally, the risk was on distribution side as well. You didn't know what is selling, what is selling, and how much is selling ideally, right? Because you found as I think Dr. Singh mentioned during the in the initially, that there was a change, consumer behavior changing continuously. It changed. I think you didn't know what products they are going to buy. Maybe it was basis the availability, because the loyalty didn't play a part. Whatever was available, it was a huge shortage in the market, and that's how they bought whatever is available for that function for which they are buying it. Now you didn't know what will sell over there. So again, there was a risk on the demand. You should be producing what is consumer requiring, but do you know that what exactly is going to sell? I think the entire demand planning was challenged in the process. So you had challenges on sourcing, in the manufacturing, as well as on the side of distribution. Those were the things, and how organizations managed. I think again, when there were so many things, we are talking about the bad part of this pandemic, and we all are witnessing on the the human deaths which are happening on one side, and the GDP is in the bad shape all across the world, kind of thing. But one thing is very clear, that this pandemic has shaken and has given us a unique opportunity again to review the entire supply chains. Now, what some of the good examples, not only my organization, but I have been hearing from the people have done during this one, is certainly, I think, one thing which you asked, Dr. Singh, that what organizations have done. I think one thing which is coming out as a winning parameter is collaboration. Is the people went into totally collaborative mode in the with the suppliers. What they are producing, the same line can produce XYZ, but they should be producing what is required by you and in the quantities you require. And mind you, these are not dedicated suppliers. They are the suppliers who are servicing to multiple organizations from the same plant. So it was a collaborative planning with the suppliers, where you found out what all to produce. It was a partnership with them, where you worked with them, and in some of the cases, even you are producing essential goods, but your suppliers are not allowed to produce. However, the organization came ahead and they approach the government that they are producing the inputs or feedstocks which go into essential goods, and that's how their plants were allowed to produce that. And that's where you brought in the partnership and collaboration with your suppliers to make it happen. Second thing was in terms of capability building, is that you might have a capability and they have their own capability. It was to be dovetailed together to get the final amplified results out of it. And those were done very well in some of the organizations. Uh, Third thing is, which I keep saying into wherever I go, is that ABC analysis totally failed. The C class item stopped the production of your high NR driving product, and that C class item which you never paid any attention, and there was only mono-sourced item. They only created the issue. Now where do we go? Is the C class, or even I'll say E or F class item also need to be paid same attention, because they were the ones which stopped your production into the plant. And that's what it gives a totally different perspective, right, on the mono sourcing, and as well as to give the attention even to that last item which goes into your final product. And that's where I think the organizations made a difference into the marketplace, that how they had been collaborating with the small suppliers as well. Another thing which comes is the MSMEs. They had lots of issues in terms of managing their working capital, as simple as that. Now that's where again the partnership and the collaborative approach came into, that you supported them in times of difficulty, maybe in terms of the reduction of payment terms, maybe in terms of financial support, which could happen together, kind of thing, and which made your lines running in the plant. So I would say there has been very good examples of all these things which have happened on procurement side over a period of this 5-6 months of pandemic. However, there are learnings as well, which is in terms of you talk about when you find that there is no alignment on the priorities between your partners, and now that makes difficult situation for you. So that's a learning, that how to align the priorities over a period of time. There is number 2 as well, is that your vendor base is so vast. Now working from home has been giving a challenge to coordinate with all of them. The technology part of it, with some of the vendors, they are not so advanced, they are not so connected, and that has raised some kind of issues in terms of coordinating. It's a simple issue, but has given the lot of I think challenges for the professionals to coordinate at this time. So that was again the learning, that how do we coordinate and how do we manage our vendor base. Now, do we go on the as I have been saying, fewer and biggers, or how do we manage our vendor base for the future to happen? So I think in terms of learning, there have been few learnings like this as well, where we need to pay attention for the future way forward.
All right, Radha, thank you very much for such a elaborate, understanding of risk from a very practical perspective and from the field. And I think that would pave way for future. If we have been talking about everything that we have done some learnings from them, even spend analysis. One element that has come up is managing the risk, bringing transparency into the whole supply chain risk processes. This pandemic is an opportunity to build strategies for supply chain resilience. And I think there are a lot of other factors, geopolitical factors, that are also paving way for this, at least in India and in other countries also. So the alternatives that people are talking about in building a resilient supply chain organization is, we need to do multi-sourcing, we need to local or near sourcing, ecosystem partnership, which Radha brought about and even Gordon talked about, manufacturing network diversification, platform and product and plant harmonization are the suggested way forward. And what we need to do is that we need to create a roadmap for the companies. I have one question. And let me put it simply to Gordon first. Gordon, do you think that single sourcing is under threat as a strategy?
The former consultant in me will answer this with the proper consultant's answer, which is, well, it depends. And I think it does depend. Is single sourcing under threat? If you are seeking to increase resilience, one of the ways to increase resilience is to have more than one source of supply. More than one source of supply that is either different geographical, that has a different supply chain. Many things that we've seen that fail from a supply chain have failed because whilst we thought we were maybe multiple sourcing, what we're actually doing is we're buying from two different front ends, but when you go behind the supply chain, it's actually the same supply chain. So we are in effect single sourcing. So I think that one of the things that's going to happen, and I was reading an article in a magazine called Supply Management earlier today that talks about our localized supply chains, the future for consumer packaged goods. And I thought that was an interesting and timely article that talks around, when you think about it from a demand perspective, then the demand is being asked for to be driven locally. So if we're thinking about how we're going to solve that demand and meet that demand, then we are going to need to think about how do we expand the supply base. Now, you talked, I think, in your opening around starting to think about broadening that supply chain and broadening that supply base and localizing. And local supply chains and the localization of many supply chains and the regionalization from global supply chains started before this pandemic anyway. What the pandemic did is it brought it very, very much into the fore, and it probably accelerated things a degree as well, because we needed, as procurement teams, to find new and different sources of supply. There was an Oxford economics report that turned around and said that 50% of procurement executives have found new sources of supply as a result of this pandemic, and those sources of supply are more local, and they're changing their operating models away from single sourcing to multiple sourcing. So I think what we are going to see is, for specific categories, not every category, because not every category can be multiple sourced. Certainly geographically, we heard from the gentleman who was buying Scotch whiskey. It's tough to buy Scotch whiskey not from Scotland, otherwise it's probably not called Scotch whiskey, right? I'm going to guess that. That would be my guess.
Yeah.
But there will be other categories where you could start to do something different, and that might be one of the ways that procurement traditionally has sought to add value, is to consolidate suppliers and bundle spend together, and then try and just get one throat to choke, if it were, right? So you've only got one source of supply. What I think is going to happen is, because you are effectively reducing the number of suppliers you can buy from when you bundle things together, we're going to see some of this spend being disaggregated out, and the output from that single supplier might be trying to be reassembled in the aggregate, i.e. by going, well, I'm not going to just replace this single supplier with another single supplier and trying to achieve the same goal, but I'm going to look at the goal that supplier is delivering for me, and then think about how I can replicate those goals and those outcomes with multiple suppliers dotted around in different supply chains. The impact, I think, therefore, on procurement teams is going to be an increase in the number of relationships that you have to manage and the number of contracts that you have to manage, as opposed to just trying to churn out tenders. That would be my answer in terms of the single sourcing piece.
Thank you, Gordon. That's amazing to hear and see the challenges and also the direction that the organizations are taking. Let me put this question to Archana about local supply chains and local sourcing or near sourcing. Is this going to happen in India? And what are the challenges for us to keep in mind while transiting to a local sourcing in order to become more resilient?
Thanks for this question. I think when this pandemic happened, we all thought that there will be a supply issue from China, and as Tarun also mentioned that we thought that there will be a shutdown in China, the imports will stop, the Chinese suppliers would not be able to service us, and we kept on building the inventories. But slowly and gradually, I think many companies have started realizing that the make from China, though it is giving us volumes and price benefits, ultimately, if there is a trade concerns like in terms of clearances on the ports with the limited people availability, then we need to have some BCPs in place, which even Rituraj was saying and Tarun was emphasizing on in terms of ensuring that we have continuous supplies. While we were assessing China's situation from more from supply of China sourced products, we never thought that the demand will suddenly go down, that we'll get into lockdown. So no, none of the companies they envisage that we will be into a lockdown situation post 3 months. So what do we do with our sales? Do we would we really need so much of inventory? Our plants would also be shut down. So that kind of strategic outlook, I think most of the companies were not having, and that's where I think uh, agility and resilience, when we talk about having in supply chain, it comes with a mix of local and global. So I would not say completely going into
Uh,
make in India will give us a leverage completely in terms of pricing benefit global scales, in terms of the kind of manufacturing footprints that we have across each company, so and the volumes that we deal with. But definitely we need to have a right mix of global versus local, and now that we have so much of emphasis on make in India in terms of MSME suppliers, developing suppliers who are trying to set up their own selves in the market. I think the opportunities lie more from the engineering companies, from where we source OPEX and CAPEX materials. So mostly, if we see that Germany's and Italy's are to be known in engineering firms and engineering companies or engineering partners, majorly like Allen Bradley or Honeywell for that matter, or Siemens. But however, if we really look at the make in India, there are some very competitive business partners that we can develop who can be really beneficial to the business, and they are also very cost effective. So I think the evaluation can be done, as Gordon was saying, in terms of having the right spend towers being set up to assess whether the local makes sense or a global makes sense, and then distributing that spend accordingly with a concise call with the volumes and the spread of the manufacturing facilities to take a decision that which one does make sense for the company.
all right. Rituraj, you all have moved to some extent during the pandemic to the local. What are the challenges of local sourcing
Okay,
during
so
the lockdown? Is it more resilient than the single sourcing, and how?
certainly, no, in any scenario, single sourcing is not, it's fraught with risk. So talking about this pandemic situation, it has helped us identify fault line in our supply chain. So therefore, it's imperative that we are able to we build resilience in our backend by activating new suppliers, by ensuring that we have at least two suppliers for each and every dry goods and wet good material. To Archana's point. So so what we have done is let me just talk about our industry. When this lockdown was announced, we the and we are dependent a lot on north-based suppliers for glass. So the production in North Belt came to an abrupt halt, because of which we had to activate an alternate supplier based out of South location. and which we immediately did in order to secure our supplies for our Q2 requirements. And we also started building up inventory at the suppliers end and provided working capital support to be able to build inventory as per our business requirement. So that's one step that we have taken. Then I also want to give a different perspective to what we can do if we are not able to compress our supply chain. So to say, talking about Scotch malt, no, we cannot compress our supply chain, but however, we can redesign and rewire our supply chain so we are able to respond fast to changes in market requirement. So we have a combination of a hub and spoke model for storage and distribution of malt across all our 30 plants. And earlier we had only one hub located in one place to cater to entire to cater to requirement of 50% of our plant. Now we are talking about building additional hubs across all zones. We are able to keep our material or malt closer to factory, and it will also help us manage disruption should it happen in any of these hubs. So these are ways by which you can create or build resiliency in our supply chain. And yes, it has to be a combination of local and global, as uh, told by our fellow panelists. For some category of products, no, it will be a local sourcing, and we will have to go for multiple source, multiple suppliers for all kinds of for all types of dry goods. And for some material, we have to no, rely on global source, but we can redesign our entire supply network, so we are able to create resiliency in our supply chain.
Tarun, what is your take on vocal local?
Yeah. So, as I look back over last few months, when we actually put into place some BCPs, where we started to develop the local suppliers, I think it's the need of the hour. So, there is no second thoughts around having local suppliers if that's possible. But the way I see it, and the way we have experienced it over last 6 months, I think there is much more work to be done as far as local suppliers are concerned in certain categories. For example, the reason we couldn't develop local suppliers in the past, why we were always willing to do that, irrespective of the pandemic or before that, was to actually have the local suppliers. But the amount of so to say, the amount of R&D or the amount of quality aspects that some of these international suppliers have been able to build in is something which has not truly percolated for sure in some categories in the local suppliers. Now that means there's a lot of hand holding that has to happen. It's not impossible, but that means it's going to be a long journey, and it's not going to be something quickie. So basically, you can work towards that. You should work towards that, but that also means that it entails a lot of time and investment in terms of resources to achieve local development. While I'm completely for the local development, but all I'm saying is that had that been possible in the past, even before pandemic, we would have done that. There are always some risks, that are there when you are developing a supplier locally, not necessarily in terms of cost. Of course, cost is likely to be lesser or cheaper, but more in terms of the quality or in terms of the specifications that you're looking at. But again, it's about category to category.
Right, right. In fact, as we see and as we move ahead, we will see, a country like India can only build up vocal and local if they really start working on their ease of doing businesses, and they start improving their logistics frameworks. All these are very important things. Moving ahead to the last question of the discussion, there's a lot of talk that we all have done together of end-to-end integration, transparency, granularity. I would like to understand the role of technology and how would technology help, right? Just rather than just the role, how would technology intertwine with the businesses to help transparency in your supply chain overall? So I'll go first to Radha to answer this question.
Uh, Yes, Dr. Singh, I think what we are talking about, let's build up some perspective first, that why we are talking about the technology and maybe the digitization of the supply chain kind of thing. One of the issue which organizations face is that there are silos in the organizations, and then information doesn't passes from one end to another end smoothly. That's number one, and which restricts the kind of decision which are being taken. That's number one. Number two is, in terms of, if you see, there is a sub-optimization of the objectives within the organization. The overall objective is either missed out or is suboptimal if the coordinated efforts are not taken over there. Now, having said that, I think how it is going to, the technology is going to help is, in terms of, number one is, if you talk about some of the it is like automation. Now you can avoid the human error and human intervention. It is simply like giving the example of creating the purchase orders. Now automation is one of the things where the technology will help, and it will reduce the kind of errors which are happening. Number two is, in terms of assisting, that technology will assist to take you the better decisions. Now, how it does is that over the better information is available to you, and you will be able to take better decisions as supply chain professional. While you are talking about, let's say, the demand, it is also that this same thing, same interaction in the time of the crisis, when we are not knowing what is the demand, however a interaction, and it's a more collaboration with the sales team, and they passing on whatever information is available down the line, will be really critical to make the better production plan, and hence the supply plans over there. And with the technology,
I think I agree with you there, Radha. Let me take, as we are short of time, let me take the question to Gordon. And Gordon, what are your views on technology, and what are the domains that the technology spans to bring resiliency?
What's my views on technology? Everyone should buy lots and lots of it. That would be my view. Look, I think the thing with technology, one of the things that we've seen in all the different CPO reports is people talking about capabilities and competencies of procurement teams. I think what technology can do is it can basically take some of those activities that people are doing and remove them, which allows the people then to go and do something else. That's fundamentally what lots of procurement technology talks about, which is essentially what Radha was mentioning. Yeah, it was around automating quite a lot of these processes as much as you can. Automating the process, the standard process, the process that you just want repeat. You want to automate those as much as possible. The second bit that I would say is, when you start talking about the spend analysis, and we talked about the spend analysis, data's great unless it's all over the place, in which case then you've got to bring it together. And then the key skill that's actually needed is to interpret what that data means to make strategic decisions. So the bit that I think that we need to start thinking about is the critical thinking. Now, some parts of this technology you can automate, like artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotic process automation, the sort of standardy type new tech that people are talking about. But the information's got to be there for it to learn, first of all. So thinking about the use of technology, it needs to be deployed to solve problems, and it needs to be deployed to then think about how it's going to evolve over the next period of time, recognizing that the competencies of the procurement function are going to change as well. And I think those two, so technology alone is not, it's not a magic wand. It's people, it's process, and recognizing that one of the things that technology can do is give you 930 rules. It's not to say that you should use 930 rules. And that's a really key point to think about technologies. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. And so recognizing that every organization is different in terms of some of the rules it wants to pop in, then that would be the first thing. Recognizing that the impact on people's competencies is the second thing. And then being able to map and pull the data out and interpret what it means to turn. So if you've seen, there's a pyramid called data, information, knowledge, wisdom, and it goes like that. And basically, you increase the ability and the effectiveness of things as it moves up that pyramid. When you start with just data, it's great, but it doesn't mean anything. The information starts to give you the insights to form a judgment, which is what the knowledge and wisdom is.
All right, thank you, Gordon. And that will end the panel discussion here. We'll take few questions, though we are on dot on time, but we'll just spend 10 minutes of question answer session. The first question is to Rituraj. As lead times are high in malts industry, what initiatives were taken to reduce lead times to align with new consumer demand?
Yeah, you're right. When it comes to lead time for procurement of malts or any other imported product, it is as high as it varies from 45 to 90 days. So the only way by which you can reduce time to market is by revisiting your inventory strategy. You have to keep malt in your backyard. You have to actually design inventory in such a manner that you're able to cater to demand as well as supply variability during lead time or procurement. So long as you're able to keep inventory to take care of lead time and variability, you're there.
Yeah, you need to define very appropriate decoupling points and buffers to really be more agile. There's a second question to Radha. How did RB manage the demand shock, which was on the right side from Vikram Srivastava?
Right. I think there were RB rather faced both kind of situation. To share with you, it is some products which were in demand and the demand went through the roof, and there were products where the demand was slashed down to the lowest levels. So we faced both the situations. Now, talking about the demand going very high, to be very frank, I think we didn't know what exactly we are going to sell off. However, we knew that these kind of products, which are the hygiene products, the demand is very high, and we having the trusted brands in the market like Dettol. I think we were sure that the demands are, we knew the market pie, that how much is the market for each of the categories, and we estimated sort of the maximum which we could produce in our plants. That was one of the thing. The line ran 24 hours to ensure that the entire capacities are used. And mind you, in spite of that, we could not fulfill the demand of the consumers. And that's where on the war food basis, we created extra capacity, and that was approaching the third-party manufacturing and those who have, because you have the challenges over there as well to approve them, because they have to be the quality, they need to be having the GMP and quality processes of the standard which you have. And that's where I think the partnership came into the picture. We created the external capacities and tried to meet the demand. So one of the thing was running, to answer your question straight, ensuring and running, working with the partners to ensure that our own internal capacities are on full swing. And second thing is finding out whatever capacities of our standard we could find out outside on war food basis.
Thank you, Radha. This question is to Tarun from Rishu Thomas. With diversification of supply base, there will be a drop in volume per supplier. How do you maintain negotiation edge with the vendor?
Yeah, I think this question nails the point very well. That's always a risk, right? So it's a trade-off. So in the current situation, when you are running out of materials, when your supply chain is at risk, it's going to be the risk management which is going to be taking the leading part of it rather than the cost management bit of it. But I agree. In the long term, once you are through this pandemic and you are outside of it, and it's about setting up contracts for the long term. How do you want to look at that? So that will always be a trade-off. Like I said, there are no easy answers. Yes, if you have developed some supplier who has helped you during the pandemic, then you can't just rock the boat and leave it once you are good with your previous suppliers, that doesn't work because that strategy is not going to be sustainable. However, it's going to be tricky, for no doubt about that. So I think there is a lot of work that would need to go in terms of both risk and cost management, and then the right answers would evolve. But yes, it's going to be a tricky bit of it.
Can
Archana,
I
there's
just
a
add to
question.
that? Can I just add to that
Yeah.
and just talk about negotiating in general? It's not all necessarily about size. When you start thinking about what things, this would be the advice I'd give to the person that gave the questions. You've got to consider all of the different variables that you have in negotiation, and we've touched on some. So it's not just about the amount of things that we're spending with them. It could be payment terms. You could do some interesting things and different things with payment terms. So really consider all the different variables that you have in the negotiation. And there's some really good books out there about negotiation, from getting to yes to it's an even better deal to there's a new book by a friend of mine called Sue Preston called The Little Red Book of Negotiation. Really, really clever thought processes around planning for negotiations. And that's to do with keeping as many variables on the negotiation table as you possibly can. So even if your demand is going, that's one variable. There are lots of other variables that you can think about doing.
All right. Thank you, Gordon. There's a question to Archana from Salifu Abdul Majid from Ghana. I would like to know what suppliers from overseas can do to change in delays of supply of goods to consumer as a result of many receiving agents practices working at home due to COVID-19.
Can you repeat your question? Sorry, I missed that.
I would like to know what suppliers from overseas can do to change in the delays of supply of goods to consumer as a result of many receiving agents practices working during the COVID.
Okay, so I think yeah, receiving agents at the customs, if you're talking about in terms of the global supplies, so I think equally the pandemic hit within India, not only the manufacturing and supplies within India, but also the government offices and officials. So trade and customs were also slowed down with a minimal manpower staffing, and that's where you could see a lot of pile up in customs and clearances. And the global supplies from Ghana and Indonesia or Malaysia, in fact, all that were coming into India were stagnated for few weeks, I will say. But nevertheless, I think it was not a continuous problem as such to reach to the consumer the right products. I think many other companies were also importing a lot of their raw materials, semi-finished goods, and we saw a standstill situation for 15 to 20 days, but beyond that it was kind of streamlined with more automated processes being driven in customs clearances, and our CHA partners also working very actively for those clearances. So I think all the global suppliers now have much better place to come into India, and in terms of the new regulations that are coming up for imports into India, what sort of duties. So consumer is getting more and more vigilant about it, what they are having, what they are eating, in their eating habits also in their in this pandemic. So I would not necessarily say it is because of the imports challenges, but consumers sitting at home doing working from home is becoming more and more health conscious, more careful about what they are eating in this pandemic. So hence the consumer habits are also changing in line with the business that we are doing. So that also needs to be taken into consideration. Thanks. I hope I have answered your question.
Yeah, thank you, Archana. Gordon, there is a question from you from Safu. He says, what is the importance of blockchain in procurement digitalization?
Blockchain. So what blockchain does is it gives you surety of the origination of the product. So what some organizations use it for is to ensure the purity of some of the ingredients that you would have. So, for instance, if Rituraj was talking about buying malt from Scotland and malt whiskey from Scotland, and remind me to give you my address, by the way, by Rituraj. I'll let you have that. Then, if you wanted to track all the way through that the finished product that you wanted to get is pure and all of the different components part of it is, then putting it on the blockchain is one of the ways to do it. What I would say and say as a piece for everyone to kind of think about when you think about AI and blockchain and RPA and machine learning and any of those four and digital twins and everything else is, why do you want to use them? So what we have come across and seen is people saying, oh, we need a blockchain. Yeah, we absolutely need a blockchain. And the general answer that I always ask back when I'm asked that is why? What problem is it you're trying to solve? What's the vision for using it? And if it's just, well, everyone else is using it, so I should too, you're never going to be able to get the value that you're thinking because you don't know what the problem you're trying to solve. So is there use for it? Blockchain specifically, that's all about making sure that the things go on the ledger and you can track them all the way through and you have this transparency and visibility of product going through the supply chain. Yes, absolutely, if there's been a problem. So if you wanted to guarantee that no one touched anything, then that is one of the ways that you can do it. I've seen it used an awful lot in pharmaceutical to ensure that those sort of products work properly. And I would imagine that when you're doing things with a lot of raw materials and you wanted to track that and to ensure that none of the raw materials are coming from places that you don't want to come from. So in consumer electronics and some manufacturing, for instance, looking at silicon and where some of the chips come from, making sure that all of those are right, then that's the kind of use case that you would seek to use them on.
Thank you, Gordon. And that brings us to the end of the webinar. And it has been a lovely discussion on almost all the aspects of supply chain, procurement, and resilience, and end-to-end resilience, which will define the future of supply chain. So I thank all my fellow panelists for being so wonderful, and we had a lovely discussion.